Alright, hello everybody. This is Scott Wingeter. Today we are going to discuss Week 9 student-led discussion. We're going to be looking into two books, Eroding the Commons by David Anderson and Imposing Wilderness by Roderick Newman. Again, my name is Scott Wingeter and I will be your presenter today. So before we hop into our analysis of the two works, let's get a better understanding of where we are in the world. I think that's very helpful. It's something I always do with my social studies classes. So I brought up Google Earth here, and we're talking about Kenya and Tanzania, and in particular with Anderson's book, we're going to be looking into this area right here, right around Lake Baringo here. If you can see that lake there with a nice island there, there is Lake Baringo. You can see here we're discussing the area west of the African Rift in the valley down here, and this is what Anderson's book is all about. So Anderson's Eroding the Commons deals with politics of ecology in Baringo, Kenya, 1890 to 1963. Is a masterful book that expertly weaves both political history and environmental history together to shine a light on the environmental disaster of the Rift Valley of Kenya during the 20th century. The British moved in around 1895. White settlers began to move into this area. It was a lot greener back then than you see here on the map. That's because of, you guessed it, land degradation. That's what we're going to be focusing in on here. Here you can see this is Lake Baringo. This is some of the, I hope I'm saying this name right, the Tugen people. Yes, there we go. I hope I got that right. I apologize if I butchered that. So they're cattle herders, they're pastoralists, and they in particular are going to be taking the conflict here was between the white settlers who moved into this area here during the early 20th century and began to have farms. They looked at this sort of as Western Europeans would, and their understanding of traditional Western culture and its ideas of private property rights. If you and I were to buy a farm here in Texas, we would expect that people aren't going to be driving herds of goats or cattle across our land. That would be a no-go here in Texas. The British were basically operating under that same cultural understanding and had that expectation of what they thought of as a natural right to private property. Something that the Tugen people, the pastoralists, did not understand or necessarily agree with. They were almost nomadic at the time. They were herders. They would take their cattle from point A to point B, and it didn't matter if they crossed your land in the process. They didn't recognize that. And so we're going to have a conflict here between the British and these pastoral herders. And basically the colonists are going to look at them as they are driving their cattle across. Some of them tried to make peace with them by renting the land and allowing them passage through. But they said, oh, those people and their cattle and their herds, they're being disrespectful with the resources. They're not utilizing them properly, and that's why the land is turning to dust and we're losing all of this good farming land. And basically the pastoralists would blame the colonists and the settlers, making the same sort of claim. A big theme in Anderson's book is that he claims that science was misappropriated for political expediency during this time period. The colonial government basically is going to back exactly what the settlers say, and they're going to make sure that that's what the science says, even if that's not exactly what the science actually said. A good intervention here in Anderson's book is that he is giving agency to the Tugen and the Chamos people. In particular, he's going to be talking about how they're going to be eventually included within the society. And he's going to highlight their ability to work within the system itself and with the colonial leadership, so that when, even though you have, for example, in 1952, this huge emergency that the state of emergency is declared during it was called the Mau Mau emergency, where you had a violent uprising of sort of native people in Kenya against the colonies power. The Tugen and the Chamos people end up working together, and one of the themes that they're looking here for is they're trying to improve the land. They're working together to figure out how they can come together, figure out a way to stop the land degradation and make improvements that are going to be both beneficial to the colonists and the settlers, as well as the Tugen people. In particular, I'd like to focus on his methodology, Anderson's methodology. A lot of this book came from his doctoral thesis when he was getting his doctorate. This was his thesis. So he did a ton of archival research. He would go to Kenya, he made trips, and he would, he just has a ton of data, old colonial records, and he spent a ton of time in the archives. But he interweaves that archival data that we all look at as professional historians as saying that's what's absolutely necessary in history, and he's able to interweave this oral history in a very meaningful way. Of course, there is a camp that says that oral history maybe shouldn't be included in professional historical work. That would be an extreme case. Some people would say that it's not as authoritative as archival data. Obviously, Anderson thinks it's a good idea, and I would agree with him personally. I think that oral history has its place for sure. These were people that he went around and interviewed. They were eyewitness to the events that happened in the 1940s and 50s here in this area of the country, and they were able to give basically their own statement about what they saw, and they were experts. They were the guys that were taking these cattle across the region. So their perspective is important in understanding the bigger picture. So that is Eroding the Commons by David Anderson, my bad. Next, we're going to look at, here, we're going to go down to the southern border of Tanzania and Kenya, their neighbor to the south, and here we're going to see the epic Mount Kilimanjaro, and just west of that is Arusha National Park. And this is where Roderick Newman's imposing wilderness struggles over the livelihood struggles over livelihood and nature preservation in Africa takes place here. You can see this is a picture taken of Arusha National Park, and you can see Mount Kilimanjaro towering over it in the back. And this is a group of people here called the Meru. If we go over here, we can see that there's a nice big old mountain right here. I mean, it looks small compared to Kilimanjaro, but what's the name of the mountain? It's called Mount Meru, named after the people. And these people were originally living here in the Mount Meru Forest Reserve. And much like Anderson's book, Newman focuses on the Muru people versus Tanzania. He examines their conflict. He's focusing on the national parks here in Tanzania, and he uses Arusha, which is about 270 miles south of Baringo, as a case study. He examines conflict between the Muru people and Tanzania, who kicked them out of their land, basically. Like Anderson, this originally was his doctoral thesis as well. A big thing that he focuses in on is it's called village moral economy, or peasant moral economy. Basically, the Muru people, from their perspective, they see it as, well, we're going to go ahead and we're going to go into this forest reserve here anyway. We're going to hunt, We're going to set up agriculture. We're going to collect stuff and resources here because this is our ancestral land. And the nation of Tanzania doesn't have the authority to even kick us out of our own land. This is our land. They actually have a better understanding of private property rights from the Western perspective than their neighbors up north here. They see this as theirs, and they're not going to allow for a corrupt government like Tanzania to steal this land from them and set up this nature reserve. And so they see that as, even though they're breaking the law, they see it as justified. And that's this concept of the village moral economy. He also argues, another big thing is he argues against this concept that Africa was this just beautiful, picturesque, version of the Garden of Eden, and the way that the West looked at this, as we can see here from our viewpoint on top of Mount Kilimanjaro. We look over across here, we see this beautiful green land out stretching all around it, and there's the forest, and that's how it's supposed to be forever, because that's how it was when Europeans first encountered it. And so that's the way that it should always look like, because we all know that nature doesn't actually change or evolve at all, right? That's basically he's trying to break that fictional view. And he basically comes across and has the same sort of methodology as Anderson does, archival information. He has a mountain of scholarly secondary sources, journals, environmental reports from the United Nations, and he ends up writing a marvelous book as well that focuses specifically on this sort of conflict with the local people and whether or not to set up these national parks and reserves. And he does agree with the concept of national parks and wildlife preserves, but he has this social aspect to it as well. So real quick, we're going to compare and contrast these two books. They're both focused on the political economy of these East African nations, specifically on the indigenous local population versus the colonial or the post-colonial government. They have a very similar methodology, and they focus on how land claims affect Native people. It's different in that the Tugen worked with Kenya, whereas the Meru work against Tanzania. Anderson looks into improvement of, I would say, private land, whereas Newman looks into how setting up nature preserves works. So a couple of the comments here is we had several different comments from the groups. Go to the discussion board down here. We have the Newman and Anderson readings. One of the things I loved was Trey Peterson's It's All the Goat's Fault. He posited an interesting concept here where, maybe they should look at, specifically in Anderson's book, instead of having goats go across, that they could switch what kind of agricultural livestock that they have, and he's suggesting that they bring pigs in. The point I tried to bring up here was that I thought it was an interesting outside the box sort of idea, but we have religious implications with Kenya having a large portions of East Africa rather has Islam is a major religion there, and they do not consume pork. It would be against their religion to do so, so that would be probably a hard sell on that. William made a very good comment about how he was looking at birds, and birds don't care about borders. I brought up the same, that's basically what happened in post-colonial Middle East, where you have Bedouins from Saudi Arabia going across every Al Anbar province on the way to Damascus, and the British basically just literally drew lines on the map and called it good. And, you know, these people who've been doing this for thousands of years aren't going to care that there's this international border here. They're going to do what they're going to do. And, you know, it's very similar to the Tujin people here. Some of the other comments were pretty good. Caitlin had some excellent points. She brought up a very brilliant point here that I thought it took me a minute to really consider. She talked about the paradoxical nature of, on the one hand, trying to preserve land, but we're going to get involved in order to preserve land. So how can we preserve this, you know, nature, yet we're going to preserve nature by getting directly involved with it? Is that we're probably not going to be able to preserve nature, you know, if we intervene in it and how it evolves. You know, we are an outside force coming in, and so is nature preservation even something that we can actually do? It was an excellent question, and something that maybe we should look into a little bit more. I think that just, you know, the intellectual historian inside of me is sort of geeking out about that particular question. So I thought those were the two most interesting answers this week. And so that is pretty much all I have. And I thought these were excellent books. In particular, I'm going to look at Newman's book a little bit closer as I write my research project, as it has to do with national parks as well. So this is, once again, this has been Scott Wingeter, and today we discussed Eroding the Commons, The Politics of Ecology in Baringo, Kenya, 1890 to 1963 by David Anderson, and Imposing Wilderness Struggles Over Livelihood and Nature Preservation in Africa by Roderick Newman. Thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful day.